Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to another episode of Boys in the Cave. I'm Tanzim, your sole co-host for today. We're glad to have you tuning in, so sit back and relax because we have a very special guest with us today. Before we jump straight into it, first, come step into the cave.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم أم حسبت أن أصحاب الكهف والرقيم كانوا من آياتنا عجبا إذ أوى الفتية إلى الكهف فقالوا ربنا آتنا من لدنك رحمة وهيئ لنا من أمرنا رشدا فضربنا على آذانهم في الكهف سنين عددا ثم بعثناهم لنعلم أي الحزبين أحصى لما لبثوا أمدا نحن نقص عليك نبأهم بالحق إنهم فتية آمنوا بربهم وزدناهم هدى.
Boys in the Cave podcast is proudly sponsored by Night Watchman Sports and Muslim Youth Today. As I said before, we have a very special guest with us today. His name is Daniel Haqiqatjou. He was born in Houston, Texas. He attended Harvard University where he studied physics and philosophy. He has also completed a master's degree in philosophy. He has also spoken at universities, and his work has also featured in outlets such as The Washington Post, Atlantic, CNN, Aljazeera, Public Discourse. And he also teaches as an adjunct faculty member at Respect Graduate School. He's also a contributor to the Muslim Debate Initiative, MuslimSkeptic.com, Yaqeen Institute, and MuslimMatters.org. So welcome to Boys in the Cave, Daniel.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I guess your resume speaks for itself, but personally, I guess I actually took notice of you through your Facebook content a long time ago, actually. You're coming with those lengthy Facebook posts, which you still do now. But the thing is a lot of people don't really read, lengthy Facebook posts. But alhamdulillah, because you dealt with Islam and modernity, a lot of people were really reading into a lot of the stuff that you were talking about. So, yeah, even my friends, they took notice of you through your Facebook account. So do you feel like that was the medium where you were basically getting public, outreach or getting noticed by the public through that medium in particular, or were you doing other stuff before that?
Yeah, I was doing stuff before I created a Facebook page. I was on Muslim Matters for a while before I had started a new column called The Muslim Skeptic. On Muslim Matters, and then even before that, before being picked up by Muslim Matters, I had my own website blog where I would write about Islam and modernity. So then it just kind of grew from there. But I like Facebook because it's just a way to casually write thoughts, things I've been reflecting on, and I use it as a sounding board to see what people think and how people react, and then a lot of that information I further develop when I'm writing essays or I'm preparing material for lectures or speaking. So it's a good medium, alhamdulillah.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. Like, I guess because Facebook connects people from all around the world, people are on it most of the time. I'm kind of guilty with that as well. But yeah, it's but with the engagement and all that, you get a kind of perspective of what people think, I guess, out there, and you can see the comments in your Facebook post, and you can see the reactions, and I guess that kind of gives an impression of how people react to big issues and big topics. So yeah,
absolutely. You get a good intersection of different people's views from around the world. So I like it. I mean, it's limited in some ways because, like you said, not many people like to just read lots of texts. So, literacy has been dropping, but as far as being able to connect to people across the world, it's really good.
Alhamdulillah, exactly. Speaking about being interconnected with people around the world, as viewers know, Boys in the Cave is based in Sydney, and you are out in America. And so through, internet and all that, we're able to connect to each other, alhamdulillah. But I also wanted to ask you, from an Australian talking to an American, because us Australians are exposed to kind of a certain perspective about America. And we hear that, through the media, that America is basically a mess, Trump this, Trump that, the war, he's going to build a war and a lot of money and war and, you name it. We hear it all. So is the reality of, American Muslims, facing a lot of racism actually true, or is it kind of glorified? Or I guess a lot of media attention because of that kind of skews the real kind of impression of America?
So do you think that I'm speaking to you at a Muslim camp right now, a detention facility? Yeah, I mean
that's the impression that we actually get, because a lot of we hear about people get convicted and go to jail for really terrorism and all that, but they don't have any the FBI, for example, don't really have a case, and we hear that a lot. So we think that's like the kind of story that goes around in America. But is that really the case, or is it not really?
I mean, there is cases like that for sure, but it didn't start under the Trump administration. I mean, this is something that has been going on since 2001. In the Bush era, and even prior to that. I mean, there is also examples from the Clinton era and so forth. So this is not something new. Trump didn't invent this kind of anti-Muslim scrutiny and surveillance and policies. In fact, Barack Obama really expanded a lot of the kind of Muslim surveillance that Bush had started, and so Trump has merely inherited all of those powers. And unfortunately, the Muslim community hasn't been criticizing Barack Obama for a lot of the anti-Muslim policies that he had while in office, because they viewed him as, he's liberal, he says nice things about Muslims, his middle name is Hussein. So there was a blind spot that we had as a community in criticizing Obama and the left generally, but as far as substantive policy, Trump is not significantly worse or different than Obama. He just is more vocally anti-Muslim, which is, a problem. I'm not trying to minimize that, but we have to be real about, what is the actual substance of the policy and what has changed. And there was a lot of hysteria and exaggerated fears about what Trump would do when he was elected, and a lot of those didn't really pan out. I joked about concentration camps for Muslims, and I mean that's what people were saying. They're saying that, look, if Trump gets elected, this is a genocidal moment in American history, right? American Muslim leaders were talking about genocide as being a possibility. So I mean, not to say that it's always a possibility, but okay, how likely is it given the reality of the political space and the larger discourse within American politics? And the thing is that kind of heightened fear blinded a lot of us to the reality of what each party is capable of doing. And like I said, there was a big blind spot with Barack Obama and the Democrats generally.
Yeah, exactly. Like, subhanAllah, even here in Australia, right? Because, Barack Obama's middle name is Hussein, he had a Muslim father. It's like, yeah, like, bro, he's one of the good guys, but subhanAllah, as you're saying, it's just basically flew under the radar, like the all sort of anti-Muslim laws that passed, for example, or the drones, for example. So that kind of, gets sidelined a bit by Muslims, but I guess that's a whole other issue. Like, I guess with going through testing times, Muslims have to go through this, subhanAllah. But I would say in America, probably from what I hear, they face the brunt of it more than here in Australia. But although in Australia, we have like bad cases of, airport harassment, for example, to people going to jail for no legitimate reasons, for example. So I guess the essence of what Muslims are facing are, it's kind of globalized in the sense that most Muslims around the world kind of had a feel for it because it has happened in the communities, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. There have been things happening with entrapment. I don't know if that's the term that you'd use in Australia, but as far as in the U.S., you have institutions like the FBI, federal agencies, who will try to entrap Muslims, usually Muslims that have a prior criminal record, or they might have some psychological problems. They might be mentally disabled. And you'll have FBI agents who will go to them in undercover and say, and act and pretend like they're Muslims and say, look, we need to go fight the government. Are you on board? Look at all the bad things the U.S. government is doing. How about we plot something? How about we do this? How about we do that? How about we buy weapons? And so they try to entrap unsuspecting Muslims who don't have any kind of ability to actually carry out any kind of plot. Like, they're not in a mental state to be able to plot against the U.S. government, but you have these field agents who are manipulating them and providing them and provoking them into getting involved with plots of the FBI's creation. So essentially, the FBI is creating terrorists. And this is what happens is that, okay, right at the last minute, they come in and say, oh, we caught, this terror cell, homegrown terror that was operating, and we've due to our counterterrorism measures, we've been able to foil another plot and save Americans. When in reality, they're the ones who created the plot. They're the ones who provoked it and facilitated and orchestrated it from the beginning. But the media narrative doesn't pick up on that. The media narrative just takes the highlights of, oh, look, a scary Muslim, homegrown, was planning to do such and such dastardly deed. And then that furthers a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment, and it justifies the kind of amount of money that's being spent from public funds on these kinds of programs. So it becomes self-justifying. And as far as presidents, this was a big program under Obama, and it definitely expanded the number of cases that happened under Obama compared to Bush. And a lot of media outlets also wrote about it and reported on it. But people are not aware of what's happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, subhanAllah, like, I guess it's very testing times for Muslims, and I guess we don't get the full picture. So I guess as Muslims, we do have to be aware of what's happening and I guess act accordingly. And speaking of acting accordingly, like in terms of current affairs, so that's where we were kind of at. Here in Australia, maybe you've heard of it, I'm not too sure, but in Australia, basically, the gay marriage laws got passed. So it's actually like a confusing time, I guess, for even people who are probably not with the whole ideology of, gay marriage should be legalized, but also with the Muslims and Muslim youth in general, we have to kind of navigate through this issue. So, so have you actually heard about what's happening in Australia in regards to, gay marriage being passed as a law, I guess?
Yeah, I got the news. I was following it. So I wasn't surprised when it passed, but I did hear about some Australian Muslims who were advocating for legalization as well, which mirrored kind of what happened in the U.S. On same-sex marriage.
SubhanAllah, yeah. I haven't heard too many cases of people, I guess the people who do say, yes, it's all right that, gay marriage is passed. it shouldn't be a bad of a thing. I guess their voices get heard more in the media than so people who are more low key about it. And basically the whole topic in it of itself, today I just want to kind of dissect it, bisect, you name it, because it's a concept that we have to navigate through. It's it's a real reality now because, probably because I have a younger sister, she's going to hear about when she's growing up, it's like different times for even Muslim youth, for example. So, speaking about just being, gay in this current society, there is a kind of debate where, gay people are either, it's nature versus nurture. So, they say, it's okay to be gay because, they're born like that. And I've also heard, people are gay because, there's no family, father figure within the family. So I guess that the whole nature versus nurture debate, continues. And because people say, it's how we're born, it's fine to, be gay, I guess, because that's how you're born. So yeah, you personally, I wanted to get your views about, do you think, being gay is due to nature or nurture, or is it a bit of both?
I think that probably a bit of both. I think it could be possible. Well, as far as Islamic conceptions of desire, shahawat, that people have, there's nothing to say that one particular shahwa could be a desire for the same sex and being physically attracted to the same sex. So that's something that has always been acknowledged within Islamic scholarship. There are many different kinds of shahawat, and we have to control those desires and be able to live our lives without falling into desires, and definitely not pursuing them if they contradict what Allah has commanded us and required of us. So young people, young Muslims, have to restrain themselves from engaging in premarital sex, right? It's shahwa for the opposite sex, but if you're not married, you haven't gone through a nikah, then it's impermissible for you to engage in opposite sex behavior, right? So that's a shahwa that you have to control until you are married. The same goes with other kinds of shahawat as well. And then one of the shahawat that has been recognized, even, within the generation of the Salaf, they recognize that, okay, especially as Islam spread outside of the Arabian Peninsula, that people could have attraction, physical attraction to the same sex. Whether that shahwa is coming from how a person was born, or the shahwa is coming from social circumstance or socialization, the impact of different social factors on the way that a person feels and thinks and has desires. Yeah, granted, that all is probably the case, but at the end of the day, what matters is being able to control oneself, control the nafs, control that shahwa, and bring it into accord and alignment with what Allah has prescribed.
Okay, so interesting you brought up the Sahaba. So would you say that during the times of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and his companions, when they were in Arabian Peninsula, basically spreading Islam and whatnot within the Arab lands and bringing the tribes together, in that time, would they have encountered gay people exactly? Or as you said, it was more when they spread outwards into other lands and stuff. That's when they encountered, gays and the reality of, I guess, homosexuals.
Yeah, I think it mostly happened amongst the tabi'een and the tabi'een. But you have athar from Sahaba and tabi'een who say that, okay, we had never even imagined such a thing, that men desiring other men, until the ayat about Qawm Lut were revealed. meaning they had not come across such a practice, and they had not even imagined that was possible. But in different, as the Islamic empire expanded by the Khulafa Rashidun, you had other territories and other cultures where it was practiced, and it was something that was known to be practiced. And then that was a surprise for some of the Sahaba and who were in these conquests. But as far as the fiqh and the tradition of Islamic scholarship is concerned, like, it was understood that men can be attracted to the same sex, to such an extent that within the books of fiqh, like, you'll see discussions of khalwa, for example, being secluded with, which we typically think of, okay, if a man and a woman are, a strange man and a strange woman are secluded in a place, then that's impermissible. You can't be alone in a room with someone of the opposite sex, someone that's marriageable, right? But the scholars also included, okay, how about a man and an attractive man as well, or a attractive young man as well with a man? Is that can constitute khalwa? And they said yes, that's also khalwa, because there's also a danger of impermissible actions occurring because of that seclusion and that privacy. And so that assumes that a man could be attracted to the same sex, but they didn't take that for granted. They did understand that is a possibility, and that people should be aware of that and should protect against that kind of shahwa.
SubhanAllah, like that example, or the idea that, I guess gay people are discussed in fiqh, that shows that, how our perception, I guess, me growing up in the modern world in the West, we think that Islam doesn't, talk about have these discussions about, for example, homosexuals and what we should do, or stuff like that, conversations like that. And subhanAllah, you just brought up that beautiful example that kind of shows that, okay, Islam actually talks about all these issues that we're just not aware. But we shouldn't take the media, for example, as our gospel to learn the deen, right? You have to actually study it to actually understand it, So I guess the Sharia takes into consideration all these things that we might not be exposed to as kind of, me, not you, for me as a layman, you know what I mean? So subhanAllah, that kind of segues into my other question, where you talked about the Sahaba not imagining that, people can be gay, for example. That kind of reminds, I guess, I don't know the percentage of, Muslims that call themselves gay, but I'd say the people that I hang with, or the Muslims in general, they can't kind of in their mind perceive why a man or man will be together. And I guess that shows that now you're exposed to the idea of, being gay within the society you're in. Suddenly you're just like, oh wow, like people are out there. That kind of, it's a kind of reflect, what's a good word to use? Mirrors what the Sahaba were kind of thinking, or that mentality that they had. So I think there's a parallel that can be drawn between them both situations, despite, being 1400 years ago, 1400 years later.
Yeah, there's definitely parallels. I think that we should also try to use the language and the framework of Islam to understand this phenomenon in the first place. Right? We should be careful not to just adopt and co-opt the vocabulary and the conceptual vocabulary of modernity and ideas that have been adopted from, or that have been developed within Western thought that might be foreign to and contradictory to Islam. So within Islam, you don't have this idea of a person, quote unquote, being gay, right? A person is gay because they have certain desires, right? Similarly, there's no concept of being straight, okay, or being heterosexual, homosexual, heterosexual. These are all concepts that are foreign to our conceptual vocabulary, Islam's conceptual vocabulary, and Islam's conceptual vocabulary is the truth. So we should try to understand how things work and how human beings are in their nature according to what Allah tells us and what the scholars have understood from what Allah has said in Revelation, and the Prophet as well, peace be upon him. So, I think we should be careful about kind of co-opting or naively using some of these words like being gay. We should just understand, like, okay, a person can have shahwa. Like, for example, the example of khalwa. The ulama, the scholars didn't say, oh, only gay men cannot be alone with other men, right? They didn't have that kind of view that just because you could possibly have a certain desire that makes you quote unquote gay, or that makes you something unique or different. No, they just noted that if you're someone who experiences shahwa for the same sex, then for you, it would be impermissible to be alone with someone of the same sex in seclusion, right? And so they recognize that sexuality is composed of all these different shahawat, and a person it's possible for a person to desire the opposite sex and the same sex, and any kind of variety thereof. And so that was part of their sophistication and understanding, human nature. So we have to go back to that mentality, and not just adopt things that are not part of our conceptual vocabulary.
Okay, so I guess you're mentioning about the definitions and that we should judge it for the action, not for them having those tendencies to want to do that. So just because they're gay doesn't mean it's like a be all and end all because they haven't done the act per se. Is that where you're getting at basically?
Yeah, that's part of it. But like I said, for example, there might be a person, okay, a Muslim youth, who has, for whatever reason, has desires for the same sex. Like he finds, it's a young man who finds other men attractive. So does that mean that he's gay? Okay, so according to the modern Western ontology or concepts, yes, he is a gay homosexual person. But this idea of creating an identity, like your identity, who you are, is defined by what desires you have. This is very problematic. Okay, it's problematic because it kind of it definitely contradicts with Islam's concepts, which is that just because you have desires, okay, that doesn't elevate to who you are and how you define yourself, right? And it's also problematic because it kind of makes it inevitable where you think that, this is who I am, therefore this is how I have to behave. I have to engage in this kind of behavior as my orientation dictates. And so that leads to committing sins, right? If you think that you're locked into a given identity, I'm quote unquote a gay person, therefore I'm going to act that out and violate the hukm, right, in Islam.
Okay.
Do I see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I go with that because even the whole concept of following your desires and we should be what we desire, that could open the doors to so many things such as, raping, killing. Like, I know it's probably a bad example to compare it to gays, but I'm just saying the whole idea of following your desires, where's the end? We can't draw the line and be like, this is where desires end, So I guess living in that liberal kind of society, it opens up. Like, for example, incest can be, it's like, it's my desires. If they're cool with it, why would it be wrong? So I guess the problem is, where do you draw the line?
Yeah, well, even incest, there are some who recently have claimed that also constitutes an orientation, right? Just like you have an orientation based on the sex that you prefer, you can be homosexual or heterosexual. and they've created a kind of identity around those two orientations. You could also be have an incestuous orientation or non-incestuous orientation. And so they've created even for, other kinds of orientations in order to pigeonhole people by these categories. And so that's problematic. It causes a lot of confusion, and that makes it seem like a person is stuck with whatever that may be.
SubhanAllah, I guess that's where kind of the West is heading towards. Like they can't put definitions and on labels on things, and it's just, for example, gender is now, I don't know where the limit will be, but I guess that's what happens when these kind of the West have to deal with these kind of ideologies, whereas I guess Islam is more firm, and then we've had those conversations before. But touching up on basically being gay and because in this society, as I said, in Australia, it just got legalized gay marriage, and people who go around championing gay marriage are like, love is love, let them do what they want. But to me, as a Muslim, I guess there's more ramifications, for example, because when gay marriage gets legalized. So what do you think gay marriage may impact, other than just the fact that love is love, but how in other ways, how will it affect society, I guess?
Well, it affects society in a lot of deep ways. We can talk about ways that are mentioned by Allah in the Quran. So this is same-sex behavior is described by Allah as al-fahisha, right? It's hard to translate fahisha, but as a kind of severe indecency, immorality. And this is something that by its nature is evil and corrupt. And it's something that affects all societies. And that's why, within the Quran as well as the Bible, the societies that engage in that kind of indecency and in a shameless, brazen kind of way, there are consequences for that. There are divine consequences for that kind level of immorality. And so as far as Muslims are concerned, and Christians as well, when this is what God is saying, that this is fahisha, this is extreme indecency and immorality, we need to take that at face value and understand that, okay, we don't want society to fall into that. We don't, because we're part of society. Okay, we're part of society, and we don't want to see that kind of corruption and immorality that will increase and bring negative consequences for everyone. So that's this is something that we have to reflect on as Muslims when we read about Lut and the people of Lut, because it's not just like one or two ayat. There are many ayat in the Quran that are dedicated to this subject. So why did Allah include that? Why did Allah communicate that to us in the Quran of the story of Lut? So that we can learn from it and can understand how civilization can degenerate and devolve through sexual indecency, right? And so this kind of attitude that we find in the secular liberal West, that sexuality and any kind of sex that you want to have is a victimless crime, and love is love, and what does it matter? This is a kind of the secularization of sexuality, where the normative or the moral content of it, the value of it is just stripped. Okay, they make it seem like, oh, it's just an animal act, and we're just animals, so why not? What's really the problem? But this contradicts, the wisdom within all religious traditions, and especially Islam. And so as Muslims, we know that very well, or we should know that very well. As far as But the thing is, we can even make arguments on a secular level. And we can say that, okay, well, there are certain sexual behaviors that cause harm, and they cause problems for society. One such kind of sexual behavior is fornication, right, and adultery. Why? How can we argue that from a secular perspective? Well, there are statistics on this. There's data that shows that children that are born in single-parent households to single mothers are more likely to fall into crime. They're more likely to fall into drugs. They're more likely to drop out of school. They're more likely to be unemployed, and many other social ills, social harms that even secular liberals will recognize. And so if the rate of, or the percentage of the population that's born into single parent households, which in the US is over 50%, in Europe is over 50%, then that will have macro level consequences for all of society. And that affects everyone. So that's not a victimless crime. It's not victimless. There's all of society is a victim to that. All of society will feel that harm. So we all have a stake in preventing that kind of behavior. And if you had a society that failed to protect against that kind of behavior, then that's very unjust, right? Because if these kinds of behavior spread, as I mentioned, there's all these social harms and social ills that will cause problems for every single individual of society. So this is how we can recognize with something like fornication. But then what about same-sex behavior? What is the harm in that? Okay. And whenever people ask, like, oh, what is the harm of same-sex behavior? It's a trick question, really. It's a trick question because they have denied the possibility of any kind of sexual behavior as being harmful, right, in and of itself. And that's something that is very foreign and alien to all kinds of philosophies, religious and otherwise, throughout history. Okay, there are certain behaviors that are in and of themselves harmful, and same-sex behavior is something that virtually all societies recognize as being harmful. But as far as things that we can mention from a secular perspective, we would say that, well, same-sex behavior is harmful to the family and to the institution of family. And this is something that also Christian thinkers and theologians will also mention, is that the way that humanity can flourish and how society can flourish is through this structure of family. And family, inherent to family, is the mother and the father, male and female. And both are needed in order to raise children to their fullest potential and capabilities as far as moral, emotional, intellectual capacities are concerned. So if you promote same-sex behavior, then that is an attack on family. That undermines the institution of family within society, and that has a ripple effect that causes all kinds of harm and problems for people who are within same-sex relationships, as well as those who are not. So these are the kinds of things that we can say when we're talking about the morality or the immorality of same-sex behavior with non-Muslims. And then if you give an explanation like I just gave, you'll get a lot of pushback. I mean, they'll laugh and they'll make jokes. I know because I've been in these conversations before. And they'll say, look, we don't buy any of that. We find it actually quite ridiculous. Who cares about family? Who cares about, father and mother? We just want to pursue our own desires and pursue what we think is what feels good. So you have this kind of hedonistic philosophy, But there's, ways that you can critique that as well. You can ask, well, do you consider any sexual behavior to be inherently destructive or immoral? And there are many that they'll say, no, only actions that are non-consensual we consider destructive, right? They'll say that, as long as it's consensual, then it's perfectly fine. But there are many examples that contradict that. For example, prostitution. Most liberals, not all, but most, will say that prostitution is something that's inherently harmful, even when it's perfectly consensual. Okay, you have a man and a woman, exchanging money for sex. And they'll say, no, inherently that is problematic. Inherently that's immoral. Well, why? There's consent there. And then the way they get out of that is by saying, it's not true consent. That's not really consent. A prostitute can never truly consent to her body being used. But that's implausible for a lot of reasons. Yeah, if you want to say that, all sexual relations are permissible and moral as long as they're consensual, and then you just have like a funky definition of consent or like a very complicated definition of consent, then you can smuggle in all of like your kind of moral commitments by using that very selective funky definition of consent that just works out so that everything that you consider or everything that the wider liberal culture, Western culture thinks is sexually permissible is preserved, and everything that is not is condemned as being somehow non-consensual, magically non-consensual, right? So it's really easy to deconstruct this whole discourse on sexuality, and unfortunately, the liberal West is very confused about sexuality and sexual morality, and we're kind of seeing a lot of that unravel around us, and we should be concerned as Muslims because we're part of, in Australia and the United States, we live within the liberal West, and many Muslims are liberals and are affected by these ideas, and we should be concerned about how people are influenced, and we should be concerned about larger society, non-Muslims as well, because we don't want, we're part of society, so we don't want society to unravel and degenerate, because we're all in the same boat. If it sinks, we're all going to go down with it.
SubhanAllah. I like the point about, basically the ripple effect onto the kids and the family. And SubhanAllah, I guess the West, where it's lost touch of, is the sense of family. And even if you look at the seerah, Prophet Muhammad taught, his family for a long time before he actually actively went out and, taught everyone or, went to different lands and stuff. He concentrated on his family, gave them, whatever they needed to know to learn Islam. And then it went to other people, So I guess that sense of family is really big in Islam, especially the rights that, parents might have, and even kids, for example, right? And once you bring the whole ideology of, it's okay to have two moms and them to have a kid, for example, and it just kind of destroys that.
They can't have a kid. They can't have
exactly.
a kid, right?
And so
two women cannot have a child.
And that becomes a big issue, right?
It's biologically impossible,
exactly.
Right?
And that's why I want to bring in this interesting story, right? I actually have it written down because I was having a chat with my mate about this whole topic, and he told me this pretty interesting story about his coworker. So just have a listen. It's pretty interesting, and I want to get your thoughts on it. So basically, he told me that he has a coworker that's gay, an older man in a long-term relationship with another man. He's a really nice guy. Some of what happened to him, I guess people can reflect on due to the children suffering in such circumstances. So him and his partner knew a lesbian couple. So the co-worker is gay and has a partner, right? And they knew a lesbian couple, and the lesbian couple essentially suggested that they could have a child through artificial insemination, and they agreed, with the idea being that they'll all be involved as parents. After the child was born, though, the lesbian couple cut out the gay couple entirely, and it was only through legal action that my friend's co-worker was able to see the son a few times in the year, which obviously he was cut up and angry about. It turned out that the lesbian couple had told the son that he had no dad, only two moms, and that kid was brainwashed to think this from a young age, basically. Despite even the woman, the woman within that lesbian couple, right? She's a pediatrician, and obviously she should know better. So it's very interesting. Anyways, later when the child was a few years old, he told his coworker that he had a friend in school who had a mom and dad, and how he wished he had a mom and dad. So, even who knows, like this is a little kid right now, he's probably 4 or 5. Who knows what effects will this be later on after he just starts developing, as a kid, just a normal kid. And I feel like it's an interesting story because it shows not only we could even talk about the power dynamics of lesbian couples, for example, but we could mostly what I wanted to mention about is the child suffering because, of that ugly situation that he's basically in, right? So yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. That's I guess it's just a drop in the ocean for many other stories that's probably out there.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's a perfect example. This supposed victimless crime, love is love. Well, it has a big impact on any possible children that are brought into this situation. So, of course, people want to know where they're from. Like, that's a basic human desire, a human need to understand, okay, who is my mom? Who is my dad? And if you have this process of artificial insemination, which is impermissible, by the way, this is not related to, completely outside the question of same-sex marriage or same-sex relationship. But it's impermissible because it confounds, okay, well, when a child won't know, okay, or won't have the ability to find out with certainty, okay, who is my father? Same thing with, fornication and adultery. Why zina is such a problem, part of why zina is such a problem is that it, militates against, nasab, understanding your origins and your lineage, right? And this what the ulama, what the scholars understood in giving the hikmah, the wisdom of why zina is impermissible, is that a very fundamental human need is knowing one's origins, okay, understanding where one has come from, who's my mom, who's my dad. And that's why it's, being a bastard child is socially seen as something that is disgraceful for that child because, he doesn't know what his origins are, who his father is, who his grandparents are, his aunts and uncles. All of that in family connection is non-existent for that person. And that's a huge harm, right? Because there's so much benefit. And this is something that Islam recognizes, and the Sharia is just built around this, partly built around this fundamental assumption is the importance of the family. And you mentioned duties to one's mom, one's dad, one's parents, rights that children have, rights of the husband, rights of the wife, and as well as the extended family and in your relations. And that's why ties of kinship are so important in Islam, because that structure is so important and is recognized as so crucial to a human being's life and a human being's psychology and understanding and sense of self-worth. But if you have things like artificial insemination, if you have things like, two moms and two dads, quote unquote, because they're not biologically the mother and the father, right? That's just a fiction that they've created. So if you have those kinds of situations, that leads to all kinds of chaos. And this example that you gave is perfect in showing that kind of chaos. Well, what about, how do you deal with divorce? How do you deal with one of the 4 quote unquote parents doesn't want to be involved anymore? What are, what is that person's rights and duties? Like, what about child support? What about visitation? What about custody? What about inheritance, right? What about all of these very important functions of a human being's life? What kind of legal structure is there to support it? And within Islamic law, you have all of that spelled out, and it's predicated on there being mothers and fathers, okay, husbands and wives. But if you eliminate that, or you undermine that, and you create all of these new kinds of relationships, then you have to, deal with the consequences and the chaos that results from that. And we're going to see a lot more, I think, of these examples come up within this generation and next generation.
SubhanAllah, I guess testing times, especially with the family dynamics at stake, the ripple effect created by basically these, homosexuality and legal gay marriage and whatnot. But we have these, I guess, as Muslims, we have these ideologies, and even non-Muslims, Christians, they can kind of, be on the same wavelength as us in regards to these kind of ideologies. And I guess we have to deal with the wider society in regards to, what's our views on gay marriage, for example. It might be tough, working in a workplace, for example. So how do we how do Muslims be, sort of part of society without kind of being looked down upon for their beliefs, especially when it comes down to homosexuality?
Yeah, I mean, that's difficult to anticipate because the standards of what is acceptable or unacceptable in society are just constantly changing within the West. I'm sure in Australia it's the case, but in the United States, I would say 5 years ago, definitely 10 years ago, even most of the liberal political parties were against gay marriage, right? And this is only 10 years ago. But now, if you were to say anything against same-sex marriage, you would be seen as a pariah, and you'd be socially outcast. So within 10 years, that's how much of a shift has occurred in public opinion on this issue, especially within the big cities, because the bigger metropolises tend to be more liberal. Within the U.S., if you went to different parts of the country, it's still socially acceptable to be against same-sex marriage. But as far as the big cities, where most Muslims are living in the U.S., it's socially unacceptable to kind of voice your opinion on this. So I think that it depends on the situation that you're in. If you're in a workplace environment, then the subject won't come up, I think. Depends on your line of work. But within the corporate world, I don't think, as of yet, the topic of, you're not going to be interrogated for your beliefs on this issue. You might be, for example, invited to someone's gay wedding, but, like a coworker's gay wedding, but you can always decline or you can make up an excuse. And for the most part, you can keep your head down and avoid the kind of direct confrontation within that workplace context. Now, there are other contexts. You can talk about contexts within school, okay, like the MSA, the Muslim Student Association at the college. In Australia, is MSA the term that's used?
Yeah.
Or ISOC?
MSAs pretty around.
Okay.
Yeah, ISOC as well, yeah.
Right. So within that context, it's easy. You can say that the MSA can have an official position. And it's easy to see others, like Christian groups, that also use, this kind of religious exception that our religion does not, forbids us from promoting or endorsing same-sex marriage. That kind of behavior is a sin, and therefore we can't endorse it. And that kind of language can be used and it can be seen as respectable within a university environment. I mean, there will be pressure, but Christians are also experiencing that pressure, and I think Muslims have to be firm in saying that, well, look, this is our religion, okay? And so far as at a university you claim to be tolerant of differing perspectives and differing religious beliefs, then Muslim beliefs should also be respected on this issue and tolerated. And that's the kind of reasoning that I think would work well within the university environment. And I mean, there's political contexts where masajid, like the masjid, is being pressured to support or to come out and support same-sex marriage. And there as well, I think that masajid can have a very clear stance and saying that, look, our position on same-sex behavior is that it is destructive and it is a source of great harm for the individuals involved as well as society. And this is what we maintain, and so we can't endorse anything that contradicts that belief. And insofar as liberal societies are going to claim to be tolerant of different religious positions, then, okay, prove that tolerance on this issue. So these are some of the things that can be said in different contexts, politically speaking.
It's interesting that you brought up the whole about masajid and having that stance. And I guess that's where I want to segue the conversation into, because we talked about, I guess, gays and homosexuals and the impact on a wider society level. But there are, people who we've discussed before that we can't outline them as gay, but we'll say that they have gay tendencies and they happen to be Muslims, right? And I guess when we say gay, this, gay, that, those gay Muslims, they're put under the microscope. And there's one side, there's one extreme where the gay Muslims, like, they're openly gay and they say, nowhere in the Quran does it say to be gay. I guess in that statement itself, we talked about earlier about the act being bad, but the act of, sodomy, for example, is haram, obviously, but maybe having those thoughts or feelings and controlling them is different, desires, controlling those desires. And then there's the other kind of, not extreme, but the other Muslims who I've heard kind of interviews and stories about. I haven't personally kind of encountered them myself, but I know other brothers have. And they basically say that, they're Muslims, they have these urges in them and they're struggling, I guess, with the deen, because it's like, why did Allah make me this way? It's really tough on me, but they're trying to be, they haven't done the act itself, but they just have those tendencies in them, but they're also trying to pray and all that, they want to be a practicing Muslim, but because of these urges, it's a struggle. And I guess me being, straight, for example, I can't relate on that level. And even, for example, if a gay Muslim like that happens to, open up a podcast episode, Boys in the Cave, and, it's about homosexuality, they'll probably be like, oh, no, they're talking about me again, or their reaction will probably be like that. So my kind of question is, how can we make them feel kind of included in the religion of Islam, like to kind of, put our arms around the shoulder and it's like, we're here to help you, buddy, because I feel like once we talk about all these topics and conversations, we kind of ostracize those gay Muslims that are actually practicing Muslims, but they're struggling with one aspect of, I guess, everyone has sort of struggles and they're going through their own struggles of, I guess, being gay.
Yeah, so there are definitely Muslims who have same-sex desires, and just like with any other desire that a Muslim might be struggling with, we should be there to support and to help them, not act on that. And I think there's nothing to prevent us from providing that kind of support. I think that there's a problem if we kind of adopt, like I said, these concepts of being gay, being straight. We're all Muslims. We're all struggling with desires, so we need to help each other in these different kinds of ways. And there are programs and there are resources that can help with Muslims who are struggling with these kinds of desires. I don't know about within Australia, but within the US, there are professionals, Muslims who have degrees in psychology and even have clinical experience, and who can provide counseling for those who are struggling with same-sex desires. There's also Christian programs that are focused on addressing kind of the emotional aspect and kind of psychological aspect of, struggling with desires. And there's no stigma around it, because it can be any desire that a person struggles with, not just same-sex desire, right? So this is something that also exists within the U.S. That I know of Muslims who have same-sex desires, who have participated, and they've found it very beneficial in managing their desires and kind of understanding their lives and how they want to proceed with their lives. So there are many examples. There are examples of brothers, like you said, who are struggling, and they've ended up marrying the opposite sex. They found a wife, and that's not a solution for everyone, but some of the individuals who have done this, Muslims who have married the opposite sex when they also have same-sex desires, it's worked out for them, and they've been able to control it. They've found that they really love their wives, that they can enjoy a relationship emotionally and sexually with their wives, even though they have these same-sex desires. And they even have kids, and they're enjoying their lives, and they've been able to manage and control the same-sex desire. So that's not necessarily a solution for everyone who has same-sex desire, but that is also something that others have done, and it's worked out for them. Alhamdulillah. So yeah, it's a very complex topic, and I think it's important that we don't alienate anyone by just making extreme statements like, "Oh, Islam condemns homosexuals," right? This goes back to our conceptual vocabulary, because if you say Islam condemns homosexuals or homosexuality, that's inaccurate. Because you can have a Muslim who has the shahwa, but doesn't act on it, and in fact is trying to control it and is struggling, and so that is a source of reward. It can be a source of reward, and Allah will reward a person for struggling against their nafs in not acting on the shahawat. So we shouldn't say, from the minbar or within the masjid in that context that, oh, Islam condemns homosexuality. Okay, because that's the concept is not valid in that way to make that kind of statement. Rather, Islam condemns the action, okay, and the kind of identification to say that, oh, I am a homosexual, that's who I am, and it is perfectly okay for me to engage in this kind of behavior. So that kind of normalization of same-sex behavior, that is clearly impermissible. Islam condemns that, as well as the action itself.
You talked about basically getting counseling, for example, or there's classes on psychologists and whatnot, and you also mentioned that it's not just for homosexuality; it could be for other things or other desires that people struggle with. And it's interesting because I wanted to touch on the idea of prioritization of sin. Like your whole hierarchy of sins, right? Because we know, for example, that you mentioned that, from the minbar, sheikhs and stuff shouldn't be mentioning that, homosexuality is condemned or whatnot. At the same time, it is happening to an extent, I guess. Or if it's not happening, it's probably happening in online, for example. But at the same time, we know, for example, that riba is a greater sin than being a homosexual, basically, or doing the homosexual act. But yet, homosexuality gets so much coverage compared to riba. Like we just brush riba under the side, like usury, interest, getting loans and whatnot. So do you feel like...
Well, maybe that's the case in Australia, but in the US, this is not a topic that's discussed at all. Or hardly you find imams discussing same-sex behavior. But what I said about the membar is the phrasing is incorrect, right? I didn't say that imams shouldn't be teaching about the dangers of same-sex behavior. In fact, I think they should be bringing up this topic and explaining in detail the Islamic paradigm of how Islam conceptualizes sexuality and human behavior, just like I've been describing, and bringing up the hukm and mentioning the hukm that this is impermissible. There's an extra need as far as prioritization. I think there should be a lot of more teaching on this subject, because there's a lot of ignorance and confusion amongst the Muslim community on this issue, and I presume that's why we're even having this discussion on this podcast, right? We wouldn't be having this discussion if there wasn't a need for it. So, yeah, I didn't mean to diminish the importance of teaching this subject and bringing Islam's teachings on this issue. Rather, we should be careful on how we word and how we phrase Islam's teaching. Okay, you won't find any statement within the Islamic tradition Islam condemns homosexuality, right? Because homosexuality is a modern term. Like that term didn't exist, right? You could say that Islam condemns liwat. Okay, you should say that. That's that's what you'll find in the tradition. That's what is the ruling on that. But as far as the phrasing of Islam condemns homosexuality, because again, there are Muslims now, past and present, who do have same-sex desire, okay, and Islam doesn't necessarily condemn them. Allah doesn't condemn such a person. It depends on how they control that desire. That is a test from Allah, okay? Just like anyone who is in any situation, a teenager who is not married and has a shahwa, okay, for the opposite sex, that's a test for them. Allah doesn't condemn you just because you have a desire. It's how you manage that desire. Do you dwell on it? Do you fantasize? Do you just expand on it and increase the shahwa within you? Or do you manage and try to diminish it and control it? Do you go out and act? Okay, just because you have the shahwa, you go to the club, right? Or you go into environments where that's practiced and that behavior is rampant, and so that that'll influence you such that you'll fall into it. Well, okay, that's going to count against you. So Islam condemns that kind of action and behavior and lack of management of the desire. But to say that Islam condemns you for having the desire, Allah condemns you for having the desire, that's actually inaccurate. So that was the distinction I was making, not to diminish the importance and value of teaching Islam's positions on sexuality overall.
I think that's a really good point you brought up in regards to Allah condemning the act but not the person, because I feel like a lot of not religious kind of gays but liberal gays, where like the reason why they don't want to delve into religion or have a kind of anti-religious sentiment, because they think that they're being condemned or God hates them for being gay. And I think, subhanAllah, I don't know about the other faiths or other traditions per se, but I know that, for example, in here in the Muslim kind of tradition, where we condemn the act, whereas we don't condemn the person. And I think that's where the kind of we're on different lens in regards to liberal gays. If we got the message out there more available that Islam says that, yeah, like the act is not good, but God doesn't hate you, if that makes sense. So I think that's yeah,
well, it depends. I mean, it depends. We have to be careful with our language and be very precise, because if it is a person who is saying that, no, this behavior is perfectly acceptable, and it doesn't have to be like just with same-sex behavior, even like someone says, oh, well, zina, like imagine, like someone comes and says, and there are people who say this, zina is perfectly acceptable, it's fine to act on that. Well, yeah, Islam condemns that person too for making such statements. So it depends, like, on who the person is and what their position is on this issue.
Yeah, fair enough. Because I'm looking for more, if there's like a liberal gay who's trying to be objective, where they're trying to seek, I guess, the truth, and then they come across, Islam saying, not condemn, like it'll draw them closer to the idea that it's the act is condemned. If that makes sense. Where I think a lot of gays aren't really aware, or the liberal gays aren't aware that's what the kind of Islamic tradition is like.
Well, what we would say is that Islam doesn't recognize being gay as an identity, right? Just as I mentioned in the beginning, like, many people, there are all kinds of shahawat, there are all kinds of desires. And so there are some desires that can be acted upon in certain contexts after certain conditions are met. And then there are other shahawat that can't be acted upon within any context. And so that's the kind of distinction that we should make. We should provide a higher order critique, right? We should be questioning the very concepts that people are taking for granted, rather than just assuming or assuming that those concepts are valid and then trying to contort ourselves in order to engage with those standards. Do you realize what I'm saying? It's a matter of, it's a difference between, like, questioning the game, are we playing the game, or are we going to question the game itself? We have to look at the bigger picture. We have to question, okay, what are these terms that we're using? Are they valid? Okay? So if you use terms that are not valid, then you lose, right? You lose off the bat. And we don't want to do that. So we have to question these terms before we engage in these kinds of discussions, first and foremost, right? And this is like, you have, at different masjids in the US at least, you have liberal activists who will go to the masjid and they'll say, we're going to teach you about LGBT because you need to be more tolerant and you need to be less homophobic as Muslims. And so they'll bring the imam and they'll sit him down to have this discussion, and they'll say, look, do you know what a lesbian is? Do you know what a gay man is? Do you know what bisexuality means? Do you know what transsexuality means? Do you know what being cisgendered means? So they have all these terms, right? And they claim that they're educating you, but in reality, they're getting you to adopt their vocabulary, their terms, okay? So that as soon as you take on their vocabulary and use their terms, then that will affect how you think about the issue. That will affect what you think is right and wrong. That will affect the whole conversation. And so as soon as you accept their terms, then you've lost, right? You've lost the debate, you've lost the moral high ground, you've lost everything. So we as Muslims, okay, within the masjid context or outside of it, we have to be very cautious about the terms that we use, and we have to use our own terms.
Hey everyone, hope you've enjoyed the episode so far. Since it is a big episode, we'll break it into 2 parts and release the other part at another date, inshallah. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email us at boysinthecave@gmail.com or find us on Facebook, and you can also follow our journey through Instagram and Twitter. Please leave a 5-star rating on iTunes, as that greatly helps us. As I always tell my team here, we plan to be one of the biggest podcasts, Muslim podcasts out there, so inshallah it happens through your support. And so from our special guest, Daniel Haqiqatjou, and myself, we wish you all the best. This is Tanzim, signing off. Assalamu alaikum.
وربطنا على قلوبهم إذ قاموا فقالوا ربنا رب السماوات والأرض لن ندعو من دونه إلها لقد قلنا إذا شططا هؤلاء قوم اتخذوا من دونه آلهة لولا يأتون عليهم بسلطان بين فمن أظلم ممن افترى على الله كذبا